In the winter of 1345, the heavy oak doors of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence did not creak as they swung open, but the sound they made echoed like a thunderclap across the entire continent of Europe. Inside, the greatest bankers the world had ever seen, the Bardi and the Peruzzi, were staring at empty ledgers. They had lent the equivalent of a modern kingdom's fortune to King Edward III of England to fund his wars, and the king had simply decided not to pay. In that moment, the power of a crown should have crushed the spirit of a merchant, yet something strange happened. The kings did not win. By defaulting on his debt, Edward III unknowingly handed the keys of the future to the very men he thought he was bankrupting. This was the moment the old world of bloodlines and swords began to crumble, replaced by a new, invisible empire of ledgers, interest rates, and paper promises. It was the birth of a world where the man who wore the crown was often less powerful than the man who held the pen. To understand how a class of commoners managed to outmaneuver the most powerful monarchs in history, we have to look at the landscape of the early Middle Ages. For centuries, power was simple. It was land. If you owned the soil, you owned the people who worked it, and you commanded the knights who defended it. Money was an afterthought, a shiny commodity used for jewelry or small trades. Kings sat atop a feudal pyramid, believing their power was divinely ordained and absolute. But as the Crusades opened up trade routes to the east, a new fluid form of power began to seep through the cracks of the stone castles. Silks, spices, and exotic dyes began to flow into European ports, and suddenly, a king's land wasn't enough to buy the luxuries he craved. He needed coin. And the people who had the coin were not the nobles, but the merchants standing on the docks of Venice, Genoa, and Bruges. As these merchants accumulated gold, they realized that moving physical chests of metal across bandit-tridden forests was a death sentence. They needed a way to move value without moving weight. This necessity birthed the Bill of Exchange, perhaps the most subversive weapon ever used against the monarchy. A merchant in Florence could give gold to a banker and receive a simple piece of paper. He could then travel to Champagne, France, and trade that paper for wool. The paper represented a promise, a ghost of value that bypassed the king's tolls and the thief's blade. While the king was busy defending his physical borders, the merchants were building a digital network of trust centuries before the internet. This system created a shadow economy that the feudal lords could neither see nor control, yet they found themselves increasingly dependent on it to fund their lavish lifestyles and endless territorial wars. But the thirst for gold among the nobility was insatiable, and the merchants knew that a king's greatest weakness was his pride. In the 13th and 14th centuries, warfare evolved from small skirmishes into massive, expensive campaigns requiring mercenary armies and heavy siege engines. A king could not pay 1,000 Swiss pikemen with a promise of future harvests. He needed hard currency immediately. This forced the monarchs to walk into the counting houses of the merchant elite, cap in hand. The bankers, like the Medici later on, did not just lend money. They sold influence. They began to insert themselves into the very machinery of the state. They became tax collectors, mint masters, and advisors. Every time a king borrowed to fight a neighbor, he was effectively selling a piece of his sovereignty to a man who, a generation prior, would not have been allowed to sit at his table. This shift in power became painfully visible in the rise of the Hanseatic League in the north. This was not a nation. It had no king, and it owned no ancestral lands. It was a confederation of merchant guilds that stretched from London to Novgorod. When the King of Denmark tried to restrict their trade in the 1360s, the League didn't just complain. They raised their own private navy, defeated the king's fleet, and forced him to sign the Treaty of Stralsund. For the first time in history, a group of businessmen had militarily humbled a sovereign monarch. They won because they understood something the kings did not. Wealth that flows is more powerful than wealth that sits still. While the king's power was tied to a specific patch of earth, the merchant's power was everywhere and nowhere at once. While the merchants in the north used ships and cannons, the bankers in the south used the much more subtle tool of double-entry bookkeeping. This wasn't just a way to keep track of sales. It was a revolutionary way of seeing the world as a series of balances and risks. It allowed the merchants to calculate the future while the kings were still living in the past. By the time the Renaissance was in full bloom, the Fugger family in Germany had become so wealthy that they were essentially the venture capitalists of the Holy Roman Empire. When Charles V wanted to become emperor, he didn't rely on his noble lineage alone. He bought the throne with a massive loan from Jacob Fugger. The merchant's influence was now so absolute that he could choose the leader of the Western world. Jacob Fugger even wrote a letter to the emperor, bluntly reminding him that it was common knowledge the emperor could not have achieved his position without the Fugger family's gold. The kings tried to fight back, of course. They attempted to debase their currency, mixing cheap copper into gold coins to pay off their debts with worthless metal. They tried to expel the bankers or seize their assets under the guise of religious purity. But every time a king cheated a merchant, the rest of the merchant class simply stopped lending to him. A king who couldn't borrow was a king who couldn't defend his borders. Gradually, the monarchs realized they had to play by the merchants' rules. They had to create central banks, honor their debts, and protect the rights of property and trade. The absolute power of the monarch was being hollowed out from the inside, replaced by a legal and financial framework designed by and for the merchant class. This evolution didn't stop in the halls of medieval palaces. It laid the very foundation of the modern world. The transition from a world of kings to a world of corporations was not a sudden revolution of the peasants, but a slow, calculated takeover by the accountants. Today, we see the remnants of this struggle in every stock market dip and every corporate lobbyist. The merchant class of the Middle Ages evolved into the global financial institutions of the 21st century. We no longer look to a king to determine the value of our labor or the strength of our currency. We look to the markets. The invisible lines of credit that once linked Florence to London have become the fiber optic cables linking Wall Street to Hong Kong. The power has moved from the castle to the counting house, and it has never moved back. As we look at our modern economy, it is easy to forget that the skyscrapers of finance were built on the ruins of feudalism. The struggle between the man with the sword and the man with the ledger ended centuries ago, and we are living in the world the winner created. It is a world where credit is more important than lineage, and where the flow of capital dictates the fate of nations. The merchants didn't just outplay the kings. They replaced them with a system so pervasive that we often forget there was ever another way to live. The gold is still there, but the hands that hold it have changed forever, moving from the divine right of kings to the cold, calculated logic of the ledger. The story of money is the story of how we decide who leads and who follows. In the silence of those medieval counting houses, the decision was made that wealth, not blood, would be the final arbiter of power. If you look closely at the world around you today, you can still see the shadow of the merchant standing behind the throne. Join us in the Money History Lab by subscribing for more stories behind the money.